English learners who are also identified with a disability are called dually identified students. Now, these students must receive both language support and disability related services under federal law. Now, however, identifying these students can be very challenging, especially when teachers are trying to determine whether a student's struggles are related to language development or a learning disability. And this can be even more difficult if the student is new to your classroom or if you are still developing familiarity with the second language acquisition process. So let's go through over the issues related to these dually identified students. Now, before we move forward, I would like to briefly highlight the historical presence of deficit thinking in the education of English learners. Now, deficit thinking refers to the assumption that students struggle in school because of internal shortcomings, like limited ability or insufficient family support. And when this perspective is applied to English learners, it can lead to misunderstanding about their learning behaviors. So, for example, an English learner who is quiet in class might be perceived as disengaged when actually a student is shy or the student may be actively listening and processing information in a new language. And this takes time, right? Now, similarly, some educators may notice that English learners take longer to develop academic language or may not immediately recall previously taught content and then assume that the student has a cognitive difficulty. Now, again, as TESOL learners and educators, we all know that acquiring a new language takes time and patience, right? Now, especially when we think about cognitive academic language proficiency or CALP, we know that developing the level of academic language needed for school success typically takes several years. So this means the challenge is often language development, not ability. And this deficit mindset can unintentionally lower teacher expectations and in some cases lead to inappropriate referral to special education when the student simply needs linguistic support and instructional scaffolding rather than remediation. I also want to briefly introduce a resource from the Office of Special Education Programs. So, if you look at the first section, it provides some general statistics. Okay, let me make it a little bit bigger. So, here it shows that 13.74% of students are served under IDEA. And among those students, English learners make up roughly 12%. And then if you scroll down, okay, let's see. Here you see that the percentage of school aged English learners served under IDEA has steadily increased over time from 9.07% in 2012 and nearly 12% in recent years, right? So I think this trend is important for us to pay attention to. And then let's go down. And then here it shows the English learners receiving services under IDEA have a higher likelihood of dropping out compared to non-English learners. So this raises important questions about whether these students are receiving the right type of support. And then if you continue scroll down, let's see. Here you see the categories for both English learners and non-English learners, right? And then you can see that English learners are more frequently identified with specific learning disability. Here you can see it, and speech or language impairment. While they are less likely to be identified with categories like autism or emotional disturbance or health impairments. So these patterns suggest that the language learning process may sometimes be misunderstood and interpreted as a disability rather than a developmental stage. So, I really encourage you to explore this webpage when you have time and think about what other insights you can gather from these statistics. And consider what they might mean for your future classroom and how they connect to equitable identification practices. Now let's come back to our slide. So, similar to all students, English learners might also experience learning disabilities, right? And these students often navigate two overlapping challenges: learning a new language while also managing a potential disability. However, because these challenges can look very similar in a classroom, distinguishing between language related difficulties and a true learning disability is not always easy. And as you might already know, many English learners go through a non-verbal period, which is known as silent period, right? And during this time, students may speak very little, but that does not mean that they're not learning. Now, in fact, they're actively observing the new language, often focusing on listening and reading as they build comprehension before feeling ready to produce language early or in a written format. So, this is a very normal stage of second language acquisition. Now, if educators are not familiar with this process, the silent period can sometimes be misinterpreted as a learning disability. But it's important to remember that this is a natural and expected phase for many English learners, and the evidence that language development is underway, not a sign of deficit or inability, right? Now, in the United States, there has been ongoing concern about the over identification of English learners for special education services. Now, as we have discussed, some educators may misunderstand the language acquisition process and mistake language proficiency challenges for learning disability. Okay, and this can lead to over identifying English learners for special education. And then, interestingly, there is also a concern about under identification. Now, some schools and teachers may hesitate to refer English learners because they want to avoid over identifying these students, and this may actually delay needed support when they actually need special education. Now, there are several reasons why English learners may be over identified or under identified for special education. And one of the most common reason is that, as we have discussed, educators sometimes have difficulty distinguishing between a true learning disability and academic struggles related to limited English proficiency, right? When students are still developing their English skills, their performance may not fully reflect their actual abilities. And then another important factor is that there are lack of appropriate assessment tools. English learners are often evaluated using instruments that are not designed for linguistically or culturally diverse students. And in some cases, there may not be enough trained personnel who know how to conduct culturally responsive assessments. And there is a shortage of special educators who are prepared to support both language development and disability related needs at the same times. So without this expertise, making accurate identification decisions becomes more challenging. Now, at the same time, as we discussed, some schools may hesitate to refer English learners because they want to avoid misidentification. So it is extremely important to evaluate students using holistic and thorough approach. Okay, so this means looking at the whole child, not just test scores or classroom performance. We will discuss this later, but the process should involve communicating with parents, understanding the students' cultural and educational backgrounds. It needs collaboration with the homeroom and classroom teachers, parents, experts, and review what accommodations have been provided and how effective they have been. Okay. Now, when educators take some time to gather multiple sources of information, they are better able to make informed decisions and avoid misidentification. Okay? All right, let's move on to the next part. So, what's at stake? What is the problem with inaccurately evaluating English learners? As we have discussed, the consequences can be significant. First of all, English learners who truly have learning disabilities but are not accurately identified may miss out on critical special education services that could strongly support their academic growth. Right? Now, on the other hand, some English learners who are misidentified as having a learning disability when they do not, they may be placed in special education unnecessarily and miss valuable opportunities to learn alongside their peers in the general education classroom. Okay. And when students are placed in classroom or programs that do not match their needs, it can limit their educational opportunities and negatively impact their achievement. Now, in this module, we discussed how important it is for teachers not to confuse language proficiency with learning disabilities, right? And I would like to share a helpful resource with you. Now, the US Department of Education provides a guide designed to help educators better understand the differences between the language development and learning disabilities. So, let's go through a quick example from this table. Now, I'm going to give you a scenario. So, imagine you notice that an English learner is not responding to verbal directions, okay? And you're not sure whether this is related to language proficiency or possible disability, okay? So, what are you going to do? Now, student is not responding to verbal directions. Okay. Now, if the student demonstrates understanding in their home language but struggles in English, this difficulty is likely connected to language development. However, if the student does not respond in either home language or English, this may signal a need for further evaluation. Okay? Now, it is also important to remember that some English learners may have limited literacy even in their home language, okay? Now, in those situations, use nonverbal support, okay? Like gestures, visuals, modeling. Now, these can help you better understand what the student knows, okay? Now, when English learners are referred for special education, now, evaluators will often ask classroom teachers what accommodations or differentiated instructions they have already tried before making that decision. So, they're going to ask you, have you used nonverbal supports? Have you used using students' home language? Have you asked the students to point to a picture or show understanding in another way if they're not responding orally? Are they recognizing key concepts, even if they're not producing much language yet? Okay. Have you used Google Translate or other tools? So, what I want to say is that just because a student is not responding in a typical way we expect, or it seems like they're not learning, it doesn't not mean automatically that they have a learning disability. So, before making a referral, uh, teachers or we need to take a holistic and thorough approach and gather multiple sources of evidence, okay, and make sure we have provided appropriate language supports first. Okay. Now, these are some of the questions that teachers need to consider before referring English learners for special education. Okay, so first, is the student receiving instruction of sufficient quality to enable them to make the accepted levels of academic progress? So it's asking, have you used differentiated instruction and presented the content in a variety of ways, like using visuals to support the students' learning? The second question is, how does the students progress in listening, speaking, reading, and writing English as a second language compare with the expected rate of progress for their age and level of English proficiency? Now, we need to remember that English learners should not be compared to native English speakers. Okay. Now, instead, their progress should be considered in relation to other English learners of a similar age and English proficiency level. Okay. Now, third is, to what extent are behaviors that might otherwise indicate a learning disability be considered typical for the child's cultural background or part of the process of adjusting to life in the United States? So it's really important to recognize that many factors influence student learning, and culture is one of the most powerful. And changes in a student life, like moving to a new country, being away from their friends, adjusting to a new environment, experiencing family transitions, and these all can impact academic performance. Okay. And what about the extrinsic factors? Okay, factors beyond classroom instruction. Okay, how does that influence students' progress? For example, students with interrupted formal education due to war or displacement, and there might be some students who had spent some time in refugee camps, and they may appear quiet or reluctant to participate. And this is not necessarily a sign of disinterest or disability, or maybe they're just adjusting to a new environment, right? So there can be many external factors that influence students' engagement and learning. So before sharing your concerns with the specialist or evaluation team, make sure you have collected clear and appropriate evidence to see if you notice any patterns that signal the student has a learning disability. Okay. I also like to share resource from the Tennessee Department of Education that I found very informative. You can click on this link, and I encourage you to review it when you have time. I'm going to show you this very briefly. So, as you can see, and again, this is from Tennessee Department of Education, and this document includes sample interview questions designed for parents of English learners. As you already know, when English learners first enroll in a school, families complete a home language survey, or HLS. And in that survey, the parents need to indicate that what language they use at home. Okay. Now, if the survey indicates a language other than English is spoken at home, the student is typically given an English proficiency assessment for screening, right? And these tools are all important, but they provide only limited information about the student. Now, this parent interview allows educators to gather deeper insights into students' background, like language use at home, prior schooling experiences, learning experiences, any concerns that the family might have. So, collecting this type of information helps schools and teachers develop a more holistic understanding of the student and better support their academic journey. So, I really encourage you to explore this resource and think about how these questions could help you better understand and support English learners in your future classroom.